Okay, this video is an addendum to two previous videos. The video on the problem of evil and also the video on the reply to Tyson on does the universe have a purpose. So I'm not going to recap everything I said in those videos. What I wanted to do in this video is add something I should have added to one or the other of those. What I did not do in those videos was to address a particular piece of theological speculation which is possibly quite helpful in understanding the history of life on Earth. Now, this is speculation, it's not a teaching of the Church, it's just consistent with the teaching of the Church and with the Scriptures. Alright. Often we talk about the effects of the human fall in theology. We talk about the fact that at some point in its primal history, humanity chose to sin. For the first time, it chose evil. Having been offered the choice between good and evil, it chose evil. And that the effect of that has been far-reaching in its history. But obviously, creation was around and developing long before man was there. So what we can't do is use the human fall as an explanation for any negative characteristics we discern in the universe or the history of life on Earth more particularly. And indeed that's not what I'm going to do. But what is often not realised is that in the scriptural story we're told that we're taught that preceding the fall of man was the fall of the angels, or some of the angels. So Satan, the chief of them, and others rebelled against God at a much earlier point. Many of the early church fathers speculated at a much earlier point we had this fall, and therefore that has to be taken into account when we're looking at the history of what happened on Earth. Because the Genesis account, even though you don't need to take it literally, does seem to indicate that Satan was already having an effect on creation, because he's represented as a serpent. He's represented as an animal, a serpent more subtle than any other creature in the garden. He's not represented as a spirit being, even though from elsewhere in Scripture and from the story itself we can discern that he's more than just a clever snake. However, the fact that he is represented as a serpent in the garden indicates that in fact corruption had already affected creation before the fall of man. Before humankind had gone wrong after its first contact with God. So, again, we don't need to take everything in the Genesis story literally, but what we do need to realise is that at some point in the history of Homo sapiens sapiens, God revealed himself to us, and it talks about God walking in the garden. There was this contact, this intimacy between God and early man, but it was very short-lived. And man, a morally aware creature, and that may well be the transition point between a mere hominid and a human being, is that moral awareness. That may well be what had happened. God, in the early stages of mankind, speaks to man in a very direct way. Of course, all that changes after the fall, due to that choice for evil. Alright, so we have this human fall, but before it happens, the serpent's already there. The creation is already affected by evil. And so it is quite possible that this had some effects on the history of life, the history of the earth before mankind, because it's interesting. Both the scripture and the tradition seem to imply that angels, spiritual beings, had and have some kind of relationship with physical events, physical processes. There's this concept in the scriptures and in tradition of certain spiritual beings having a special relationship with particular aspects of nature. Now, if that's true, then obviously you can't rule out the fact that there were effects on creation when some of those angels rebelled against God. So it may well be that there were aspects of the history of life on earth, and still are aspects of life on earth, that are not as they were originally intended to be. And it may even be speculated that one of the big differences between what was intended and what actually happened was the degree of oversight or spiritual care of the physical unfolding of the universe. It may be that that particular oversight was abandoned or lessened. So there are reasons to believe from the scriptures themselves that even before the fall of man there was another fall that affected creation, and so therefore we can't rule out that it had some influence, some impact on the evolution of life on earth until we get to man. That doesn't change anything I said in the other videos. It's still the case that it's rather foolish to look at the history of the evolution of life on earth and say, well, all this stuff happened and then man's only the last tiny percentage of that. As if that fact in itself proves man's insignificance. Well, it doesn't prove either his significance or his insignificance. You could just as easily read that evidence and tell another narrative based on it. Say, well, there you go. You do 99% plus of history of Earth of life on Earth, and there we are at the very end. It's almost like it all was meant to lead to us. All of that process, as complex as it was, and then here we come, right there at the very pinnacle, at the very peak. You can look at it that way, and there's no scientific evidence to discern which of those two storylines is the preferable one, because it's not a scientific question. We have the evidence of how short a time we've been here, how much time preceded humanity, but the significance of that is really an aesthetic question, a question of how you view the significance of things based on how they look, and that's really not something you can determine scientifically. Again, you've got one story which says we're such a short time span compared to the whole history of the universe, so therefore we can't have been that important, or the one that says here we are at the end of that process, so we must be important. And really, there's no scientific way of deciding between those two ways of looking at it. So that's pretty much all I wanted to add on that particular point. So I think I'll finish it there.